Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a sequel of a previous lesson from the 4th chapter of Peter's first epistle. We made it all the way up to the first 11 verses. We're going to take it from the 12th and all the way to the end. And as we divided the labor between, as established in this lesson's predecessor, was that in the 3rd chapter it speaks of living together. These are principles of which Christians, how to live together, wives, husbands, and then just the brotherhood. And then in the verses we covered in the preceding lesson to this, we learned about living for God and what that all means. But we elaborated on that in anticipation for that, because the trajectory, the pattern that's established is in the 3rd chapter. We read of suffering for doing good and doing right, and what that means and how that happens, and that's what they're living in. It's a reality to them, its immediate audience, and it's a reality to every Christian in some sense in every age. And then there's the suffering for being Christian, what you are. One of the 3 times we read the word Christian in the New Testament is in the passage we're going to be covering today. But we actually want to take it back slightly further in order to explain the theme I've been developing as I've been doing 1 Peter. This is my final one, but of the recent series. Did it start to finish? But the sanctification through suffering. So suffering is necessary for their sanctification. Now, it is in the furnace of affliction where quality Christians are made, and it's in the furnace where we receive the light. This is where we really examine our priorities, and our faith is tested, and it's a refining process. That's why these fiery trials, of which we read of in the first verse we'll be covering in the chapter, we're going to be devoting to. Trials come about them, and persecution was going. He establishes in the 1st chapter, he establishes who he's writing to. He's writing to the elect of saints throughout the Roman province of Asia Minor, corresponds to modern country of Turkey, and he describes them as those who are protected by the power of Elohim through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time, in which you exult, even though for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by manifold trials, in order that the proving of your faith, much more precious than gold that perishes, and proven by fire, may be found to result in praise and respect and esteem at the revelation of Yahshua Messiah. So the entire reason they're going through what they're going through right now, this intense persecution, was the refining process. It's comparable to making gold in a physical sense. That's the foundation for the metaphor. So it's not necessarily literally a trial by fire, but that was a very real possibility. A lot of early Christians were burned at the stake and crucified and beheaded and thrown spears in and all the rest and stoned. But it's to result. That's the end. This is what they're geared and designed for, is esteem for the revelation to be worthy of the worthiest moment in all Christian and human history, the return of the Messiah, his second coming, the one which is our hope and our prayer when we say the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come. We're asking for him to come bring the kingdom. And then in the 2nd chapter, the 20th through 21st verse read, "For what credit is there in enduring a beating when you sin? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure, this is grace with Elohim." So what reward, what claim is there for beating? Now, a lot of our difficulties are sin-induced and disobedience when we're Christians. They're the results of disobedience rather than follow God. We follow sin. And so sin is the host of this web of troubles in the world in which we live, which we must exist in, yet a part of and above and beyond through, and we are at war with the world. That's why the persecution comes for doing right. That's what he's trying to set them to do. If they're going to suffer worthily for the name of the sake and not for your own disobedience. For this you were called, because Messiah also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Now, as disciples, we are indelibly connected to the Master, who is this Messiah known as Yahshua, and he provided our example in his suffering, which he took all the way to the end, to the exquisite agony of the bitter passion. If we call ourselves our disciples, if there was a cross in his life, so too must there be in ours. Not necessarily a literal one, but to the immediate audience, first century Christians in Asia Minor, Turkey, this would have been very real possibility. And then in the third chapter, we're just going to read the 14th verse before we get into the part we're actually going to cover in the main lesson. I feel like there's a lesson before the lesson in the ways I've been doing these lately. Verse 14, but even if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed, and do not fear their threats, neither be troubled. So when we fear Yahweh and the judgment, we will consider it a sound investment to suffer the reproaches and the ridicules and the mockeries and the imprisonments, beatings, deaths, and executions of the world, if necessary, because this faith that we have and the resurrection is so strong that we are willing to die for it, literally and metaphorically. Daily we must dying is a daily process we should endeavor to undergo daily, so be in the spirit of self-sacrifice in order to go unto a daily death and repeat every day for the rest of your life. For it is better, if it is in the will of Elohim, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. This is obvious to anyone who has an intermediate understanding of Elohim and who he is, or God, as he's more commonly known. But the will is the motivating factor. Now, we suffer in the will because we pray for the will, the knowledge of that will, we respond to it, and we embrace it without question or criticism or complaint. That is what we owe him, because the goodness which awaits us, the suffering, the sanctification process which is developed in the suffering, is going to qualify us for heaven. And that's really the last one we need to cover. We're going to start with the lesson itself, verse 12. Beloved ones, do not be surprised at the fiery trial that is coming upon you, to try you as though some unusual matter has befallen you. So he's telling them not to expect persecution, and he's probably writing to an audience that is in the midst of persecution. And when we're being persecuted, we think it's going to go on forever and ever. But he's telling them not to freak out if and when persecution does, because he's also writing to another audience, posterity, us. So when this development happens, when we find ourselves persecuted for whatever reason, I know we're spoiled brats living in 21st century America, at least early 21st century America. A lot of Christians in the world out there or in other countries are dying for the faith as we speak. So we really don't have it so bad. But, we should expect this to come in our life. We should be prepared for it to come and be refining our faith even while we are prospering, to prepare us for the deluge, which will and must come, perhaps soon and suddenly. Not inconceivable that it could happen in our lifetimes, personal opinion. But as you share Messiah's sufferings, rejoice, in order that you might rejoice exultingly at the revelation of his esteem. So Peter, once in the Gospels, he's recording as objecting to the Messiah's revelation that he must suffer. He after making the correct confession about him, he has a sudden lapse of faith, and he blurts out loud. He was an impulsive, outspoken, energetic, but really loyal man before he was transformed more totally by the Spirit which came after him. But he says something similar to Paul's fellowship of the suffering, of which Paul writes of in Philippians 3:10. When one of us suffer, all of us suffer. So the Messiah himself enters into our pains, so too must we, if only by empathy for our brothers and sisters in the Messiah out there. But the motivating factor again is also the ultimatum, because he is going to return, and within the revelation of his esteem, every day in our life and every year and every decade should be designed to prepare incrementally for that eventuality, because it could come soon and we want to be worthy at that moment. I think we read a verse somewhere earlier that was slightly similar language, but we covered so many ranges that we can't even remember which one. If you are reproached for the name of Messiah, bless, because the spirit of esteem and of Elohim rest upon you. On their part he is blasphemed. For your heart he is praised. The most significant thing we noted from this reading is the Trinitarian emphasis. In the Christian theology, the concept of a Trinity is of a monotheistic deity who exist in three distinct personages, but are connected to the same cause and purpose and force. But their ministries always and often interchange. So in this case, the name of Messiah is the controlling element, and Peter himself rejoiced at being considered worthy. He is one of the ones that Luke wrote about in Acts 5:41, the apostles who rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. So Peter was someone who had practiced what he was preaching to this audience. Persecution and pain were not an alien, abstract subject for the author or its immediate audience. These men really went through the ringer for the faith, and we are indebted to them in ways we could never possibly repay. So the only way to pay it is to pay it forward, to make the most out of what they did and what they provide, and pass it on to the next generation, so we can keep running this race that we've been running for over 2,000 years. Where was I? The spirit of esteem is the one that makes it all possible. That's a distinct agent that stems from and derives from the Ruach, because it's capitalized here. And Elohim, so that's all three of them, rest upon you. For on their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is praised. So they don't even know it, but blasphemy, they're bringing disrespect and dishonor to his name, even if they don't even know what his name is. That's the way of the world. But we who follow the way, we are praising him all day, throughout the day, every day. For you do not let any of yours suffer as a murderer or thief or doer of evil or as meddlers. So there were definite do's and don'ts for suffering, and worthy suffering, which is what he was trying to instill. So obviously, like I said before, sin creates a lot of problems and dilemmas, and makes this world inextricably complicated to navigate through because of the sin that literally surrounds us. But we still have to do it, and there are ways to do it wisely, and that's what we are here to hopefully educate you towards. But if you're going to suffer, don't do it for the wrong reason. Do it for the right reason. There is such a thing as suffering for doing wrong. There's also a distinction with a difference, which is suffering to doing right. And suffering for doing right on the surface does not make sense, because we are conditioned culturally to believe the premise to be axiomatic, that if we suffer, if we do wrong, we will suffer. But I think a Christian education counterbalances that by giving perspective and meaning, and telling children the reality of what they're signing up for. So there are definite do's and don'ts: murderers, thieves, doers of evil, meddler. They're synonymous with just the scum of the earth, sinners that no one likes and no one wants to be, no one pities and no one envies when they get their just retribution. Because it is time for judgment to begin from the house of Elohim, and if firstly from us, what is the end of those who do not obey the good news of Elohim? So the judgment begins in the house of Elohim. That's the church. That's us. It begins with the church and the Christians in it, because we are the church. The church is not the buildings. The the church is the people who gather in the buildings, so our bodies take precedent in that analogy. But if there are a lot of people who creep into our churches and call themselves Christians who are not saved. So 78% of America classifies themselves as Christians. I can tell you that 78% of America is not saved. They are not going to heaven. They are not they are Christians in name only, most of them, mathematically speaking. Amongst those who classify themselves and call themselves Christians. A lot of them just may not know any better. They've been told they're Christians, so they, just accept it and go with it. But what awaits those who are outside of the bask in protection of the one who, the Creator, there is for those who are wicked and reprobate and just given to sin, as sin grows inexorably out of them and from them and exudes from them, these are the people without the light of the life working in them, and they are surrounding themselves with darkness and evil influences. How much worse is it going to be for them, for those who do not know the way and embrace the suffering that we sign up for when we are calling ourselves on the way? So the demands for discipleship are eternal in every age. If it was true for Peter and Matthew and all the rest, what was true for them was that they were to deny themselves, carry their crosses, and follow me. And Peter did that, at least in a very literal sense. He denied himself. He forsook his fish net. He embraced the call without hesitation. He was just so eager to enlist with this man, and he remained eager throughout, energetically bound. The most trusted and loyal and preeminent of the apostles, at least in the master's lifetime. But he's there depicted in the Gospels. There's a lot of warts, and there's a lot of defects, and there's a lot of mistakes, and there's a lot of errors. But he learned from them, and so too can we. That's why the record is honest. It does not conceal the truth of the Bible. One of the witnesses for the truth of the Bible is that it does not deny the reality of sin, and Peter did 3 times he denied the master, and before that he was so presumptuous and talkative and outspoken that he blurted out that he would follow him to the end. And then in the resurrection form, Peter, long story short, Peter hope dies because he realizes he can't even ask this man for forgiveness anymore. He's in the grave. He's gone. Then 3 days later, he rises and eventually reveals himself to the 500 witnesses, and Peter was certainly one of them. And he told him in John's 21st chapter that he must suffer, and this was the fate of all the apostles, the ones who walked with him and the ones who became apostles, such as Paul. They all died for the faith except John, but that was a different story, and that's a great chapter to read, John 21, for why Peter must die like all the others, and John alone lived to a long life, but it wasn't comfortable in the end. He was on the penal colony of Patmos, which was at the end of the earth. It was an island, secluded location, 6 miles by 10 miles in length and width, of people who were gathered imprisoned. They were isolated on this isolated rock in the Mediterranean Sea, and there he wrote the book of Revelation. But at one point he did, according to legend, get tossed into a pot of boiling water. Talk about a literally fiery trial. Remember what we said in the opening words, a fiery trial. Do not be surprised. He literally had a fiery trial, and a lot of Christians have been burned at the stake. That's a literally fiery trial. So the furnace affliction for us is metaphorical, but we do have very literal examples throughout the scriptures of men who walked and embodied these exalted dimensions of these virtues. And if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where shall the wicked and the sinner appears? I feel like I need to reread the verse I just read just to connect it to that. But remember, the main thing that is communicated, I realized I went on at least one undisciplined tangent, but this is live, this is real, this is how we do it. He says that the judgment begins in the house of Elohim. How much worse is it going to be for the wicked? So this connects to that. If the righteous one is scarcely saved, where shall the wicked and the sinner appear? So the righteous is scarcely saved. We have a fool's expectations and hope to make it back to divinity in heaven for all eternity, but that hope is provided in God, who became one of us and bore our sin penalty. And through his righteousness, he can impute it on those who were purified through the spiritual disciplines throughout the ages. Salvation belongs. The formula is the same in any generation. And so if we cower out when we are called to take a stand for Christianity, we are essentially forsaking the faith. And I feel that Christianity itself is in a very tenuous position at this moment in time in our history, at least in Western culture. It is on the retreat. So then, those who suffer according to the will of Elohim should commit their lives to a trustworthy Creator in doing good. The Creator provides and protects the persecuted saints, so He's protecting them the whole while. He knows what they're going through. He's the one sending them there. He created the universe, so his sovereignty, if it extends to the creation of the foundations of the earth and to everything on top and beyond, it certainly is. His will is applicable to us, his creation, who it calls us to do good and be good because he is good, and his goodness stems from himself. He alone is good, and in fact it was a blasphemous claim for the ancient Jews, which are somewhat out of the audience that we just discussed and are about to close up on. But I forget where I was going with that thought. So I just want to thank you for being here. I'm going to title this one Sanctification Through Suffering, or something to that effect. But thanks. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.